On a freezing winter morning in a small Midwestern town, Officer Robert Chen sat in his patrol car, sipping his coffee and watching the quiet streets come to life. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the freshly fallen snow. As he prepared to end his night shift, something caught his eye, a lone figure walking along the shoulder of the road, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. The figure was a woman, probably in her mid-30s, bundled up in a worn winter coat that had seen better days. She walked with determination, her shoulders squared against the biting wind. Officer Chen's instincts, honed by 15 years on the force, told him something wasn't quite right. In this weather, at this hour, nobody should be walking alone on these dangerous roads. He decided to follow her, keeping a safe distance to avoid frightening her. As the minutes ticked by, he realized she wasn't just taking a short walk, she kept going, mile after mile. The woman occasionally stopped to catch her breath, rubbing her gloved hands together for warmth, but she never wavered from her path. 1 mile turned into 2, then 5, then 10. Officer Chen couldn't believe what he was witnessing. He'd driven this route countless times, but watching someone walk it gave him a whole new perspective. The woman trudged through areas with no sidewalks, carefully navigating icy patches and crossing busy intersections. As the sky began to lighten, he noticed other details about her journey. She would occasionally check her phone, presumably for the time, and adjust her pace. She carried a small backpack that looked heavy on her shoulders, and despite the harsh conditions, she maintained a steady rhythm in her steps. 2 hours into his observation, the woman finally turned into the parking lot of a local diner. Through the window, Officer Chen could see her quickly changing into a waitress uniform in the back room. She had walked nearly 20 miles just to get to work. His heart sank as he realized what he'd witnessed, a story of determination that most people would never know about. This woman had been making this journey in silence, asking for no help, seeking no attention. She was simply doing what she had to do to survive. As Officer Chen watched her tie on her apron and begin her shift with a smile, he felt a mix of emotions wash over him. This wasn't just about a long walk to work anymore. This was about human resilience, about the quiet struggles people face every day, and about how sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden in plain sight. He knew he couldn't simply drive away and forget what he'd seen, something had to be done. That evening, Officer Chen couldn't shake the image of the woman walking those 20 miles in the bitter cold. After his shift ended, he found himself parked outside the diner again, watching as she emerged, now dressed back in her winter clothes, preparing for the long journey home. Instead of following this time, he gathered his courage and approached her. "Ma'am," he called out gently, not wanting to startle her. "I'm Officer Chen. Would you mind if we talked for a moment?" The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patel, initially seemed wary but relaxed when she saw his kind eyes and genuine concern. As they sat in the warm diner over cups of coffee, she slowly began to share her story. 6 months ago, her husband had passed away unexpectedly, leaving her with 2 teenage children and mounting bills. Their only car had broken down beyond repair 3 months later, and with most of their savings gone to medical bills and funeral expenses, there was no money to replace it. The local bus route didn't reach their rural home, and ride-sharing services would have eaten up most of her paycheck. "So I walk," she said simply, stirring her coffee. "We need the health insurance this job provides for the kids. And the people here, they're like family. They work with my schedule, let me pick up extra shifts when I can. I can't let them down." Officer Chen learned that Mrs. Patel had been making this journey for the past 3 months, in all weather conditions. She would leave her house at 3 a.m. to reach the diner for her 6 a.m. shift, walk back home in the afternoon, catch a few hours of sleep, and do it all again the next day. Her older child would make sure the younger one got to school, and they would handle homework and chores together until she returned. "The walking, it gives me time to think," she added, trying to find a silver lining. "I pray, plan our budget, and sometimes just enjoy the quiet. It's not ideal, but we're managing." Her voice carried no self-pity, only quiet determination. Officer Chen noticed her hands, red and chapped from the cold, with small calluses forming from the daily walks. Yet here she was, speaking about her struggles without complaint, more concerned about her children's welfare than her own comfort. What struck him most was her dignity. She wasn't looking for handouts or sympathy. She had found herself in an impossible situation, and instead of giving up, she had put one foot in front of the other, quite literally, and kept going. As their conversation continued, he learned more about her family. Her children were excelling in school despite their hardships. The older one had even started a small online business selling handmade crafts to help with expenses. They had created a system at home where they all contributed, cooking, cleaning, studying, making the best of their situation. "The hardest part isn't the walking," Mrs. Patel confessed, her eyes glistening. "It's not being there when my kids leave for school, not being able to attend their events because I'm either working or walking or trying to catch up on sleep. But they understand. They're so strong." Officer Chen felt a deep respect growing for this woman who had turned her daily marathon into a testament of maternal love. He thought about his own mother, who had raised him alone, working multiple jobs to give him a better life. Mrs. Patel's story wasn't just about poverty or transportation, it was about the lengths a parent would go to provide for their children. As they finished their coffee, Mrs. Patel glanced at the clock and politely excused herself. She had another long walk ahead of her, and her children would be waiting. Officer Chen watched as she bundled up again, preparing to face the cold night air. But this time, as she walked toward the door, he knew he couldn't let her make that journey again. Not alone, not anymore. Sometimes, being a police officer meant protecting people from immediate dangers, crimes, accidents, emergencies. But sometimes, it meant recognizing a different kind of crisis, one that didn't come with sirens and flashing lights, but was just as urgent. As he watched her disappear into the darkness, Officer Chen pulled out his phone. He had some calls to make, and he knew exactly where to start. This woman's strength had moved him deeply, but strength alone shouldn't have to carry such a heavy burden. Sometimes, he realized, the true measure of a community isn't in how it treats its most fortunate members, but in how it responds to those who need a helping hand, even when they're too proud to ask for one. The next morning, Officer Chen sat at his desk in the police station, his coffee growing cold as he made phone call after phone call. His first call was to Pete Thompson, owner of Thompson's Auto Repair, who had been his friend since high school. As he shared Mrs. Patel's story, Pete's usual jovial tone turned serious. "Bring her car to my shop," Pete said without hesitation. "Let me take a look. Maybe it's not as bad as she thinks." But they both knew that even if the car could be fixed, that was just the beginning of the solution. Mrs. Patel would need help with insurance, registration, and ongoing maintenance. Throughout the day, Officer Chen reached out to various community members. He called Principal Rivera at the local high school, who immediately understood the situation's impact on the Patel children. He contacted Mr. Garcia, who ran the local grocery store, and Mrs. Williams at the community center. With each call, the network of support grew stronger. What happened next surprised even Officer Chen. The story of the mother walking 20 miles to work began spreading through the small town like wildfire, but not as gossip, as a call to action. People began asking how they could help, what they could do. The diner's regular customers, who had come to love Mrs. Patel's warm smile and efficient service, started leaving larger tips. But they wanted to do more. One customer, a retired teacher, offered to help her children with homework after school. Another, who worked at a local bank, volunteered to provide free financial planning services. Pete's initial inspection of Mrs. Patel's old car revealed what they'd feared: the repair costs would exceed the car's value. But he didn't stop there. He reached out to his network of auto dealers and found a reliable used car that would suit the family's needs. The price was still significant, but now they had a concrete goal to work toward. The high school's student council, inspired by Principal Rivera's passion for the cause, organized a fundraising drive. They set up a website, made posters, and spread the word through social media. The local newspaper picked up the story, not focusing on Mrs. Patel's hardship, but on the community's response to it. Officer Chen watched in amazement as people from all walks of life stepped forward to help. The owner of a local tech shop offered to upgrade the Patel children's old laptop to help with their schoolwork. A group of retired nurses organized a meal train to ensure the family had hot dinners. Even the youngest members of the community got involved. A Girl Scout troop decided to donate part of their cookie sale proceeds to the cause. But what touched Officer Chen most was how the community respected Mrs. Patel's dignity throughout the process. They understood this wasn't about charity, it was about neighbors helping neighbors, about recognizing and supporting the incredible strength she'd shown. The biggest challenge was convincing Mrs. Patel to accept the help. When Officer Chen approached her again at the diner, she initially resisted, insisting she couldn't take such generosity. Her eyes welled up with tears as she explained how her husband had always taught their children to be self-reliant. Mrs. Patel, Officer Chen said gently, accepting help when it's offered isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you've touched people's hearts with your strength. This community wants to support you because you've already given us so much, you've shown us what real determination looks like. He shared with her how her story had inspired the high school students, how it had reminded people of their own struggles and the help they'd received along the way. He told her about the retired teacher who said her own mother had once walked miles to work, and how helping the Patel family felt like honoring that memory. Slowly, Mrs. Patel began to understand that this wasn't just about her. It was about community, about people coming together to support one of their own. Her story had awakened something in the town, a reminder of their shared humanity and the power of collective kindness. As Officer Chen drove home that evening, he passed several spots along Mrs. Patel's former walking route. Each familiar landmark now held a different meaning: the corner store where she would sometimes stop to warm up, the bridge she crossed in the pre-dawn darkness, the stretch of road with no sidewalk where she had to be extra careful. He thought about how many times he had driven past people without knowing their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. This experience had changed him, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. It had reminded him that sometimes the most important part of his job wasn't enforcing laws, but building bridges between people. The transformation taking place wasn't just about solving Mrs. Patel's transportation problem. It was about a community rediscovering its heart, about people realizing that their individual actions, when combined with others, could create meaningful change. And it all started with one police officer deciding to look beyond the surface of what he saw that cold winter morning. 2 weeks after Officer Chen first followed Mrs. Patel on her long walk to work, the community's efforts had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. The high school's fundraising campaign had exceeded its initial goal, with donations coming in from neighboring towns as well. But what happened next showed that money was just one part of the equation. One morning, as Mrs. Patel prepared for her usual walk, she heard a knock at her door. Outside stood Officer Chen, Pete from the auto shop, and several other community members. In the driveway sat a well-maintained used car, a practical, fuel-efficient model that would perfectly suit her family's needs. "The car is just the beginning," Officer Chen explained, as Mrs. Patel stood speechless. Pete stepped forward with a folder containing documentation for 1 year of prepaid insurance, registration, and a maintenance plan. The local gas station had even provided a gift card for fuel. But it was what happened next that truly captured the spirit of the community's response. A young woman stepped forward, the daughter of the diner's owner. She had recently gotten her business degree and had been helping her father manage the restaurant's finances. After reviewing the books, they had realized they could create a new assistant manager position, and they wanted to offer it to Mrs. Patel. "Your dedication showed us what kind of employee you are," the owner explained. "Walking 20 miles to work? That's the kind of commitment we need in management. Plus, the morning shift loves you, and our customers ask for you by name." Mrs. Patel's children, who had been watching from the doorway, couldn't contain their excitement. For the first time in months, they saw their mother cry, not from exhaustion or worry, but from joy and gratitude. The promotion would mean better hours, better pay, and most importantly, more time with her family. The community's support had created a domino effect of positive changes. The local bank had set up a free financial literacy workshop series, inspired by Mrs. Patel's story, to help other families in similar situations. The city council, moved by her dangerous walk along roads without sidewalks, had fast-tracked a proposal to improve pedestrian safety in the area. But perhaps the most meaningful change was happening in less visible ways. Mrs. Patel's older child had started a support group at school for other students dealing with loss and family challenges. The younger one had begun volunteering at the community center, wanting to help others like people helped us. 3 months after receiving the car and promotion, Mrs. Patel's life had transformed in ways she never imagined. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by a natural glow that came from proper rest and reduced stress. Her new position as assistant manager at the diner had revealed leadership skills she didn't know she possessed. One sunny morning, as she organized the staff schedule in her small office, a space that still felt surreal to call her own, she heard familiar heavy footsteps. Officer Chen had made it a habit to stop by for coffee during his morning patrol. But today was different. He wasn't alone. With him was a young woman, trembling slightly, clutching a worn purse. The officer introduced her as Mrs. Li, a single mother who had been walking 3 hours each way to her night shift job at the hospital cafeteria. She had been too proud to ask for help, but a night patrol officer had noticed her walking pattern, remembering Mrs. Patel's story. Without hesitation, Mrs. Patel stepped out from behind her desk. She saw in Mrs. Li's eyes the same determination, the same quiet desperation she had carried for months. Over cups of steaming coffee, Mrs. Patel shared her story, not as a tale of hardship, but as proof that asking for help wasn't admitting defeat. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It had transformed into an unofficial community center of sorts, where people felt safe sharing their struggles. Mrs. Patel had started a small support group that met during off hours, providing a space for people to connect and help each other find resources. Her children, too, were flourishing. Her older child's online craft business had grown, inspired by the community's entrepreneurial spirit. Local business owners, including the diner's regulars, had started mentoring the teenager, sharing insights about marketing and customer service. The younger one had improved dramatically in school, no longer worried about their mother's exhausting journey to work. Officer Chen watched this transformation with a sense of wonder. His simple act of following a walking figure in the dark had sparked something remarkable. The police department had initiated a new community outreach program, encouraging officers to look beyond traditional law enforcement and really see the people they served. The local paper ran a series of articles titled Hidden Heroes, featuring stories of resilience in their community. Mrs. Patel's story had opened people's eyes to the quiet struggles many faced daily. The articles highlighted not just the challenges, but the solutions that emerged when people worked together. 6 months after Mrs. Patel's story began, the changes in the community had taken on a life of their own. What started as one police officer following a walking figure in the dark had grown into a movement that touched lives far beyond their small town. The local news station had picked up the story, and their coverage caught the attention of a regional network. When they approached Mrs. Patel for an interview, her first instinct was to decline. She had never sought attention for herself. But Officer Chen helped her see that sharing her story might inspire other communities to look out for their vulnerable members. The interview took place at the diner, where Mrs. Patel felt most comfortable. As she spoke about her experience, she made sure to highlight not just her own journey, but the incredible response of her community. She talked about the regular customers who had become like family, the auto shop owner who helped maintain her car, and the countless others who had stepped up to help. The hardest part wasn't the walking, she told the interviewer, her voice soft but steady. It was feeling alone. But I wasn't alone, I just didn't know it yet. Sometimes help is already there, waiting. We just need someone, like Officer Chen, to notice and take that first step. The story resonated with viewers across the state. Other communities began reaching out, wanting to learn how they could implement similar support systems. The police department started receiving calls from other precincts, asking about their new community outreach program. Pete's auto shop had become a model for other businesses. He had expanded his maintenance workshop into a full program, partnering with the local technical college to offer basic car repair classes. Some of his regular customers even volunteered to help teach, sharing their knowledge with others who couldn't afford professional repairs. The diner support group had grown too. What started as informal meetings over coffee had evolved into a structured network of community resources. Mrs. Patel worked with local social services to create a resource guide, helping people navigate available assistance programs. Her personal experience made her an effective advocate. She understood both the practical and emotional challenges of asking for help. Officer Chen noticed changes in his fellow officers too. They had begun sharing stories during briefings about community members who might need support. The department had created a special commendation for community service, inspired by Officer Chen's actions. The first recipient was a young officer who had helped an elderly man get to his medical appointments after noticing him struggling at a bus stop. Mrs. Patel's children had become advocates in their own right. The older one had started a peer support program at school, helping other students whose families were going through tough times. The younger one had joined the school newspaper, writing articles about community heroes, ordinary people doing extraordinary things to help others. One day, a letter arrived at the diner from a woman in a neighboring state. She wrote about how hearing Mrs. Patel's story on the news had given her the courage to ask for help when she needed it. She had been skipping meals to afford gas for her commute, too ashamed to tell anyone. After seeing the interview, she approached her church community, and they had rallied around her just as Mrs. Patel's community had done. The letter was the first of many. People began sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. Each story was different, but they all carried the same message: when communities come together, impossible situations become manageable. The diner's bulletin board became filled with these letters, each one a testament to the power of breaking silence and reaching out. Local businesses had started looking at their practices differently too. The grocery store implemented a delivery service for elderly and disabled customers. The pharmacy began offering extended hours and a prescription delivery option. These changes weren't just good business, they were responses to community needs that had gone unnoticed for too long. Mrs. Patel's promotion had inspired the diner's owner to look more closely at advancement opportunities for all staff. They had implemented a formal training program, helping employees develop management skills. Several other local businesses had followed suit, creating clear paths for career growth within their organizations. The city council had taken notice as well. They had formed a transportation committee, specifically focused on identifying and addressing barriers to workplace access. Regular citizens, including Mrs. Patel, were invited to participate, bringing their real-world experiences to the planning process. One evening, as Mrs. Patel drove home from her shift, a drive that still felt like a luxury, she passed a familiar figure walking along the road. Instead of driving by, she pulled over. The woman was headed to the late shift at the hospital, 3 miles away. Without hesitation, Mrs. Patel offered her a ride. During that short drive, she learned the woman's story, another tale of quiet struggle, of doing whatever it took to provide for family. Before they parted, Mrs. Patel shared her business card and information about the diner support group. "You don't have to walk alone," she said, remembering how much those words would have meant to her 6 months ago. As she watched the woman enter the hospital, Mrs. Patel thought about how much had changed. The 20-mile walks that had once seemed like her burden to bear alone had become a bridge, connecting her to a community she never knew she had. Every person who heard her story and found the courage to reach out or offer help was extending that bridge further. The simple act of noticing, a police officer following a walking figure in the dark, had created ripples that continued to spread. It had shown people that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions, a moment of attention, a decision to care, a willingness to help or accept help. As winter approached again, the town prepared to mark 1 year since Officer Chen had first followed Mrs. Patel on her 20-mile journey. The anniversary wasn't planned as a celebration of any one person, but rather as a community gathering they called Walking Together Day, a reminder of how one simple act of noticing could change countless lives. The diner was chosen as the natural location for the gathering. Its walls now held dozens of photographs documenting the year's transformations, the day Mrs. Patel received her car, her promotion ceremony, the first community support group meeting, and countless moments of everyday kindness that followed. On the morning of the anniversary, Mrs. Patel arrived early to help prepare. The diner's parking lot had been transformed with strings of lights and long tables where people could share a meal together. The weather was cold, just like that fateful morning a year ago, but this time the warmth of community drove away any chill. As people began arriving, each brought something to share, not just food, but stories. The young mother who had found childcare through the support group. The elderly gentleman who now had reliable transportation to his medical appointments. The teenager who had started a homework club after being inspired by Mrs. Patel's children. Officer Chen arrived in his patrol car, just finishing his night shift, just like a year ago. But this time, instead of following someone in silence, he was greeted with warm hugs and handshakes. Other police officers came too, many of whom had embraced the department's new community outreach approach. A year ago, Officer Chen spoke to the gathered crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "I followed a figure walking in the dark. I didn't know then that I was also following a path that would lead our entire community to change." Mrs. Patel taught us that strength isn't just about enduring hardship, it's about being brave enough to let others walk beside you. Mrs. Patel's children had prepared a surprise presentation. They had collected video messages from people across the country who had been touched by their mother's story. Each clip showed how the ripple effect of kindness had spread far beyond their small town, a community in Florida that had started a transportation assistance program, a diner in Oregon that had implemented similar employee support systems, a police department in Texas that had revamped its community engagement policies. The local bank president stood up to make an announcement. Inspired by the past year's events, the bank had created a new low-interest loan program specifically for transportation needs, making it easier for working families to afford reliable vehicles. They were calling it the 20 Miles Fund, a name that brought tears to Mrs. Patel's eyes. Pete from the auto shop shared how his repair workshop program had grown. Several of his students had gone on to start their own small repair businesses, creating a network of affordable maintenance options for the community. One of these students was Mrs. Patel's older child, who had discovered a passion for mechanics while learning to maintain their family's car. The diner's owner announced that they were franchising their business model, not just the food service, but the community support aspect as well. Each new location would include dedicated space for support group meetings and resource sharing. Mrs. Patel had been promoted again, this time to oversee the community outreach programs for all locations. As the gathering continued, people naturally formed small groups, sharing stories and making connections. A woman who had recently lost her husband found comfort talking with Mrs. Patel about grief and resilience. A young father struggling with transportation issues connected with Pete about the repair workshop program. The high school principal shared how the emergency fund, inspired by Mrs. Patel's story, had helped dozens of students stay in school despite family hardships. The fund had expanded to include not just emergency assistance but also mentorship programs and career guidance. Mrs. Lee, the woman Mrs. Patel had helped months ago, was now helping others navigate social services. She had become a certified community health worker, using her own experience to guide others through difficult times. Mrs. Patel showed me that our struggles can become our strength, she told the gathering. When we help others, we heal ourselves. As the day progressed, someone suggested walking a mile of Mrs. Patel's old route together, not the full 20 miles, but enough to remember. The group walked slowly, Mrs. Patel pointing out landmarks that had once been her only companions in the pre-dawn darkness. But now, surrounded by friendly faces and supportive voices, those same spots held different memories. At one point during the walk, Mrs. Patel fell into step beside Officer Chen. "Did you ever imagine," she asked quietly, "that following a stranger in the dark would lead to all this?" He shook his head, smiling. "I just knew someone needed help. But you taught us all that help isn't a one-way street. When we lift others up, we all rise together." Back at the diner, as the day drew to a close, people began sharing their hopes for the year ahead. The gathering had become more than a commemoration, it was a commitment to continuing the work they'd started. New initiatives were proposed, connections were made, and promises to help were exchanged. Mrs. Patel's worn walking shoes, still displayed in their frame, had been joined by other symbols of transformation, photos, letters, newspaper clippings. But more importantly, they had been joined by new pairs of walking shoes, not worn out from solitary journeys, but ready for walking together, supporting each other, making sure no one in their community had to walk alone again. As the winter sun set, casting long shadows similar to that morning a year ago when Officer Chen first noticed a solitary figure walking, the gathering showed no signs of ending. People lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of community they had found. In the glow of the string lights, surrounded by the fruits of a year's worth of kindness, it was clear that this anniversary marked not just a memory, but a continuing journey, one they would all walk together. 5 years had passed since that cold winter morning when Officer Chen first noticed Mrs. Patel walking in the darkness. The small town had transformed in ways no one could have predicted, becoming a model for community engagement and support across the country. The diner, now a bustling community hub, had expanded its seating area to accommodate the regular support group meetings. Mrs. Patel's office wall displayed a map dotted with pins, each representing a town or city that had implemented similar community support programs inspired by their story. The worn walking shoes remained in their frame, but they were now surrounded by photographs, letters, and news clippings telling stories of lives changed and communities transformed. On this particular morning, Mrs. Patel arrived early, just as the sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She often came at this hour, remembering the solitude of her long walks. But today was special. A film crew from a major documentary series had arrived to capture what they called the 20 Miles movement. As she prepared for the interview, Mrs. Patel's thoughts drifted to all that had changed. Her children were now in college, the older one studying business and automotive technology, the younger one pursuing social work, both determined to continue the legacy of community service that had become their family's hallmark. Officer Chen, now the department's Community Outreach Division Chief, arrived with his morning coffee. The position had been created specifically to expand and oversee programs that helped officers better serve their communities. Under his leadership, the department had become nationally recognized for its innovative approach to community policing. "Remember when you used to follow me in your patrol car?" Mrs. Patel asked, smiling as they sat in the quiet diner before the crew arrived. "Now look at us, we're leading people instead of following them." The documentary team wanted to capture the ripple effects of that single act of noticing. They interviewed Pete, whose auto repair workshop program had expanded to 20 locations across 3 states. His original shop now served as a training center, teaching both technical skills and the importance of community service. The local bank president spoke about how the 20 Miles Fund had grown into a full-fledged non-profit organization, providing transportation assistance and financial education to working families nationwide. What started as a simple loan program had evolved into a comprehensive support system, helping people maintain not just their vehicles but their dignity. Mrs. Lee, once a struggling single mother herself, now directed the community health worker program at the local hospital. Her team of certified workers, many of whom had once needed help themselves, provided support to families facing similar challenges. "We don't just help people access resources," she explained to the camera. "We help them believe in themselves again." The high school's emergency fund had become a model for schools across the country. The principal proudly shared how their student support program had improved graduation rates and college attendance. More importantly, it had created a culture of caring that extended far beyond the classroom walls. The film crew captured footage of the weekly community dinner at the diner, where people from all walks of life gathered to share meals and stories. These dinners had become a tradition, ensuring that no one in the community ever had to eat alone. The conversations around these tables had sparked countless initiatives and connections. As the day progressed, more people arrived to share their stories. A young mother talked about how the community's support had helped her start a small business. A retired teacher described the tutoring network that had grown from helping Mrs. Patel's children. Each story was unique, but they all echoed the same theme: when people walk together, no journey is too long. The documentary team was particularly interested in the lasting changes in community attitudes. They found that people were more likely to notice signs of struggle in others, more willing to offer help, and more comfortable asking for support when needed. The shame and isolation that often accompanied hardship had been replaced by a spirit of mutual aid and understanding. Officer Chen shared how the police department's approach had evolved. "We used to measure success by the number of arrests or tickets issued," he explained. "Now we measure it by the number of lives we've helped improve. Every officer is trained to look beyond the surface, to see the human story behind every situation." The crew filmed Mrs. Patel walking her old route, now transformed with proper sidewalks, lighting, and rest areas. Each milestone along the way had been marked with a small plaque sharing a piece of the story, creating what the town called the Hope Trail. School groups often walked the trail, learning about community, perseverance, and the power of kindness. As the sun began to set, the documentary team gathered everyone for a final scene at the diner. The parking lot filled with people who had been touched by the 20 Miles movement, families who had received help, volunteers who had given their time, officials who had changed policies, and countless others who had been inspired to make a difference. Mrs. Patel stood before them, her voice steady and strong. "5 years ago, I walked 20 miles in darkness because I felt I had no choice. Today, we all walk together in light because we choose to. Every step we take together makes the journey easier for someone else." The crew captured the moment as the community shared a meal together, their conversations and laughter filling the evening air. Children played between the tables, elderly residents shared stories with teenagers, and newcomers were welcomed with open arms. This, more than any program or policy, was the true legacy of the 20 Miles movement, the understanding that community isn't just a place, but a commitment to walking life's journey together. As the filming wrapped up, Officer Chen and Mrs. Patel stood in the diner's doorway, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. "You know," he said quietly, "that morning when I decided to follow you, I thought I was just doing my job, keeping someone safe. I never imagined we were actually following a path to something much bigger." Mrs. Patel nodded, thinking of all the lives touched, all the changes made, all the hope restored. "Sometimes," she replied, "the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be. And sometimes, what looks like the end of the road is really just the beginning." The documentary would go on to inspire similar movements in communities around the world. But for the people of this small town, the real story wasn't in the footage or the interviews, it was in the daily acts of kindness that had become as natural as breathing. It was in the knowledge that no one had to walk alone anymore, that help was always just a gesture away, and that every journey, no matter how long or difficult, was better when shared. The end.